The last year and a half or so have been very turbulent for Pakistan if we look at the political climate. There was a vote of no confidence. Then we saw that the provincial assemblies were dissolved. In addition to that, there were events of May 9. We have a new caretaker setup. What are the confinements of a caretaker government in Pakistan? What is its mandate? What is its legitimacy? And how much power does it really hold in order to execute big reforms, harsh reforms?
In the case of Pakistan, we have seen several times, over half a dozen now, these caretaker setups, which are supposed to be neutral. This caretaker setup might, A, stay on for much longer, and B, it might be taking decisions that are sort of beyond the ambit of a caretaker, this kind of transitory setup. And the decisions that it takes will have long-term implications on the political economy of the country.
How long is this government going to last? Is this setup conducive for Pakistan's trajectory towards a full, complete, autonomous democracy, or will that further strengthen the stronghold of the establishment?
When it comes to caretaker setups, swallowing the bitter pill that that an elected government might not want to, brings to the fore then another dilemma, which is the will of the people. Because if we're living in a governance system that is having elections and people are voting for a government and giving them that mandate, a caretaker setup clearly does not have that mandate.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning into New Wave. My name is Nauriaz Rana, and I'll be your host for today's program. Today, we will be talking about Pakistan's caretaker government and the setup. What does that imply? What does that signify? And what will be the implications on Pakistan's democratic trajectory? To speak on the topic today, I have a very special guest. I would like to introduce Mr. Syed Muhammad Ali, who's a development anthropologist. Ali is an adjunct professor at the University of Johns Hopkins and American University. He's also a non-resident fellow at the Middle East Institute and writes weekly columns from the Express Tribune. Thank you so much for joining us today, Ali.
My pleasure.
So without further ado, I'll delve right into the topic. The last year and a half or so have been very turbulent for Pakistan if we look at the political climate. There was a vote of no confidence that was initiated and then finally led to the ouster of former Prime Minister Mr. Imran Khan. Then we saw that the provincial assemblies were dissolved earlier this year, and they've still been actively governing, going beyond the stipulated 90-day period that usually they are meant to govern for. In addition to that, there were events of May 9th, which inadvertently led to the unraveling of Pakistan's, it can be said anecdotally at least, that led to the unraveling of Pakistan's largest political party at the national scale. So given all that, the previous government completed its tenure. We have a new caretaker setup, which currently begs a lot of questions regarding its validity, regarding its legitimacy, because the caretaker government in Pakistan is very unique in the sense that it delves away from the regular or the natural form of caretaker setups that are formulated in Westminster democracies. So on that note, I wanted to ask you about what are the confinements of a caretaker government in Pakistan? What is its mandate? What is its legitimacy? And how much power does it really hold in order to execute big reforms, harsh reforms?
So Nauriaz, like you said, Pakistan is not unique in terms of having a caretaker setup, but besides Bangladesh, which sort of, toyed with this idea of having this neutral, technocratic caretaker setup, other countries, be it Australia or Malaysia, that do also use the caretaker mode, have used it in the past, they would normally curtail the power of an existing government, right, to basically oversee elections and then new government come into power. In the case of Pakistan, we have seen several times, over half a dozen now, these caretaker setups, which are supposed to be neutral, and they come in with the idea of being able to create a level playing field for all political parties, and then let the will of the people express itself. Now, with the current setup, it has technocratic elements in it, no doubt. Some very competent people, but at the end of the day, the manner in which this has come about, indicates that this caretaker setup might A, stay on for much longer, and B, it might be taking decisions that are sort of beyond the ambit of a caretaker, this kind of transitory setup. And the decisions that it takes will have long-term implications on the political economy of the country.
Well, thank you for saying that, because especially I want to highlight the fact that now that the IMF program is in full throttle and it has brought the brunt on the common man who are facing inflationary pressures throughout Pakistan. There've been an energy crisis and people are somewhat revolting, but they have very limited options. It really brings, harnesses the question as to, is the caretaker government legitimate enough to enact these reforms to bring about such an evil for the people of Pakistan? Or secondly, have they been brought up at such a time with the go-ahead from a lot of behind-the-door powers who feel that had these reforms been implemented by elected governments, they would have faced greater backlash now that, this caretaker setup does not really cannot be called out for because it's there for the interim period. But here you mentioned a very crucial point that the big question that is being asked is how long will it last? And a number of laws were passed before the interim government came in, the caretaker government took the reins of the country, which actually enhanced their executive authority and allowed them the mandate to bring about a lot of other changes that usually are not that form within the ambit of the caretaker government. Secondly, I want to really bring under the spotlight the appointment of Senator Anwarul Haqqaqar, who's the caretaker prime minister, who before this appointment was relatively not very well known in the political affairs of Pakistan or at the higher levels of the podium of national policies. And he's been brought about by the army, to say so, which again raises another crucial point that Pakistan, for lack of a better word, has been a hybrid regime where the military establishment has had a very overbearing influence and a very overbearing power. In that sense, how long is this government going to last? Is this setup conducive for Pakistan's trajectory towards a full, complete autonomous democracy, or will that further strengthen the stronghold of the establishment?
Well, I think two complex questions here. So let's break them down, and let me take the former question first. So when it comes to caretaker setups, swallowing the bitter pill that that an elected government might not want to, brings to the fore then another dilemma, which is the will of the people. Because if we're living in a governance system that is having elections and people are voting for a government and giving them that mandate, a caretaker setup clearly does not have that mandate. So, that is a dilemma to be wrangled with. But I think we have to sort of, from this kind of more theoretical premise, we have to get down to the nitty-gritties, in the realities of Pakistan. And there, many people have alluded to the fact that, we do have post-colonial elitist economy, right, where top-down and patronage-based systems are the way that the government is run. So, it's not from the grassroots level up, and that has a historical context. And that's a government model, a top-heavy government model that has kind of been followed over the various decades of military and non-military rule. So within that context, still, there is this desire for, coming back, right? So, I mean, any government, when it's coming, especially, to the crunch time of the next elections, the prior budget is going to be populist, right? Whether the donors like it or not. So there is, there is that, but and then of course we can get into, when you have subsidization. I mean, to give you an example of the wheat subsidy, for instance. So, it's used by the government and the international community, the IMF, World Bank, don't want the government to spend money on that kind of subsidization, but it uses the rhetoric of food security and, but when you look at how that subsidy is framed and who benefits from it, it is not the poor, landless, malnutrition, chronically hungry people of the country. So there's elite capture, relative elite capture, even there. So, these are two elements, but then there's also the fact that we are in such a tight spot right now, right? And I mean, if you look ideologically, I mean, you tell me ideologically, the variation that we have. I mean, and I think that's not only uniquely a Pakistani problem. I mean, if you look at England, if you look at the US, I mean, you've had the Democrats in the US from Clinton onwards, they've moved center, right? Thinking that they'll sway some of the vote bank from the Republicans. But then what the Republicans did was they kind of moved more right, right? Okay. And similarly with Tony Blair onwards, the Labour Party became sort of, very corporatized. And in Pakistan, if you remember, the manifestos, I think the manifesto that the PPP had put out in, a decade or so earlier for contesting elections, that's, I think, when they'd won. But their manifesto at the time was very centrist, right? So, yeah. I mean, that kind of, those socialist aspirations, whether they were fulfilled or not, again, another debate, but it was a very centrist agenda. And, we saw Imran Khan, of course. I mean, I remember going to the Minare-Pakistan, the first big one where, one could see that there's visible support behind him, whether that support was orchestrated and some of it was actually, genuine as well. And he was, talking about, these loans and devaluation, in his public, in his public speech. And he said that every time we devalue, we end up owing more money to the IMF. And I'm going to, and we've had others talk about breaking the kashbol, the bowl, the begging bowl. Yeah. But again and again, we've had elected governments go back, and not that they've implemented those reforms perfectly, but they do, take austerity measures, to try and curb the fiscal deficit.
Yeah, and Khan Sahib employed this exact same area. So he went for currency devaluation, and then eventually he had to go to the IMF as well and other bilateral partners for those loans. So rhetoric again is one thing, but just to your point, implementation of those policies is just entirely another story.
So I, in that sense, I feel that, yes, I mean, while it would be problematic for a caretaker setup to, to take on further loans or make those commitments, and there's been some tinkering, to allow it to continue, economically negotiating with the IFIs, given the desperation of the country. But the current standby arrangement is a standby arrangement, right? And the idea, I think, even the bank and the IMF, the IMF in particular, realizes that they, need to have continuity of policy, and that's why it's a short-term loan for now, till the next government comes in. So that to me is of less concern. And now I'm sort of, moving in the direction of your second question, because the other political economy questions, that the caretaker setup, and not only the caretaker setup, by the way, I mean, even the so-called coalition government, had started making moves which were quite, quite contentious. So, for instance, this idea of corporate farming, which in its own right has a lot of issues, in a agrarian, elite captured, sort of highly skewed rural economy that is Pakistan, trying to do corporate farming, besides the efficiencies argument, is, it does not create a lot of rural employment because it's a capital driven, sort of productivity strategy. So, so it's not only corporate farming, it was the allowance of 45,000 acres in the Punjab, to the military to undertake corporate farming. So, how that corporate farming in itself might not be, panacea for rural development and addressing rural poverty and food insecurity. And then the fact that the military is doing it. So, and of course, we have a very long history. People like Imran Ali, I mean, the economic historian, did a great job, and others prior and subsequent to him in highlighting sort of, the colonial legacy, right? So how the British had started giving lands. I mean, for them, it made sense, right? I mean, it's like, that's why the revolt in the Punjab didn't quite take, because, there were all these like canal economies. But essentially, they had started giving land to war veterans, right? To the recruiters. So, I mean, there are, if you think back a few generations, all these colonels and whatnot who had these huge land grants given by the colonial administration, not having even gone into warfare, but they were great recruiters, large landowners, and they were sending a lot of, people, even in World War I and World War II. So, so that precedent, and then the Ghodapal scheme, right, and the livestock farms, then created, I mean, they stayed basically even after partition. And we saw a few years earlier, in Okada and elsewhere, the sort of troubles around trying to change the nature of sharecropping into leasing, right? And it became this big thing during the Musharraf era. So now, if we have decisions like these being taken, right, and there was some sort of judicial, pushback, but I think then even the judiciary conceded the last I checked. And, if plans like that go ahead, right, and the military's imprint on the political economy is already significant. Yes, it is the strongest institution in the country, but it didn't become competent or organized, just naturally. I mean, it did so because it takes on so many of the resources of the country, right? I mean, if you look at the allocation, the budgetary allocation. And of course, there are security concerns. I mean, we don't live in the most friendly part of the of the world. So these are complex issues and intertwined issues. But ultimately, now the military sort of positioning itself, even more firmly in the economic sphere, raises sort of concerns, around capacity, around approach. And this is an escalation. It's not something that doesn't have precedent. I mean, it has precedent preceding partition, and of course, subsequently. I mean, even with the CPEC authority, I mean, the military was already deeply engaged with China, on that BRI.
Absolutely. And here I would just like to further elaborate that it's not just economy in terms of making revenues or generating revenue, but also in terms of their strong say in how the economic policy is formulated and what are the foreign/economic policy engagements with other partners, whether those are multilateral organizations, development banks, or whether those are multilateral partners, because we've seen very regularly that the chief of army staff is on a state visit to either Saudi Arabia or China, and he's very actively involved and engaging those deals, being at the forefront of them. And therefore, therefore it, really highlights the question and brings about it further that this caretaker government may be, another leverage point for the army to execute the economic plans that they've had manifested for Pakistan, or what they had uh, idealized, or the vision that they had. But on that note, I want to go back to the former part of your answer, where you mentioned about usually for a government who's ending its tenure and prior to the election period, engaging in any austerity measures, getting rid away of subsidies, even though they're market failing subsidies, is basically political suicide. Because if you hike the price of the petrol, if you levy additional electricity tariffs, there's very little chance that you will be re-elected into power. And therefore, Pakistan, unfortunately, is in a peril at the moment where we need some stringent measures, some strict measures, and therefore the caretaker government may be, I don't want to use the word breath of fresh air, but might be suitable in this time of need where other democratically elected parties or governments may not have had the will, the intent, or maybe even the power, the courage to undertake these reforms. And another, on the flip side, what I wanted to put forth towards you, that obviously there's this democratic element that can be, that is traded off because they're not elected into power. But what we've seen in this particular caretaker government as well, that we have there's, some individuals who are very well internationally recognized experts. I'm just quoting a few names here. Umar Saif, for one. He has a doctorate and a postdoc from MIT. We have Shamshad Akhtar, who was the chair of the UN's ECOSOC, and there are other such individuals. So isn't this a good thing for Pakistan to have such people on board and, steer the wheel for a bit, stabilize the country? Because when we go back to elected governments, then, obviously there's a give and take. There's clientelism, patronage is awarded, and there's some corruption that seeps in as well. So on that note, what do you think? Is there some silver lining?
I mean, these are people who have been, the former, ambassador to the US, and again, the ambassador now, Ambassador Jalil, again, also a competent person. But these are people who, might have been appointed by different political parties, might have political leanings, but there's no reason why we cannot have, these people in positions of power, even otherwise. Yes, there are broader vested interests. There is, political patronage, etc. But I think, issues like corruption, etc., they're so endemic and so structural that, just having a technocrat, at the fore for a few months is not going to be able to grapple with those types of issues. So, so I wish that there was a quick and easy fix, that Pakistan would be put on the path of progress. But if we're going to have an elected government subsequently, we often see the baby being thrown out with the bathwater, right? If you remember when the donors also got behind General Musharraf's local government system, because subsequently the democratic governments didn't have much appetite for local governments, but and a lot of money was spent on it, to build capacity, and some of them were doing very interesting work. In Jadawala, in Karachi, big cities like Karachi, but that entire system had to be thrown out. So depending on now who's coming to the fore in 6 months from now, I don't think November is going to happen. Although the president has indicated, but he's on his way out, and the election commission is supposed to be finalizing the constituencies. So let's see when elections are held. Let's see who comes to the fore. It could be speculation is it could be a very fragmented coalition. These ideas, I think anything that happens now will not have significant longevity, nor will it have the gestation to make a real difference on the real complex issues.
Fair enough, fair enough. So let's assuming that elections do not happen in November, or even otherwise, how do you think the West, the Western part of the world and other countries view this arrangement in Pakistan?
I don't think that there's, given the state of the world, I mean, if we look at, in our neck of the woods, Sheikh Hasina, for instance, has, she's been in power for a while now. Khaleda Zia has, and the BNP are still being heavily persecuted. I mean, the US doesn't like it. Didn't call them, I think, to the second summit of democracy. In Sri Lanka, the Rajapaksas have gone away, but they still exert influence. They have elections coming up. In India, of course, I mean, India is rising, but is also being used for counterbalancing, China. But there's increasing recognition that here is not the mother of democracy. Here, what we have is an illiberal democracy. So, so let's engage with them with, real politic considerations in mind. So, given how countries like the US or China engage with the rest of the world, I mean, yes, there'll be, calls for democracy, but essentially at the end of the day, they will engage with whoever is in power, right? And there are some, some narratives which are more convenient, for the external stakeholders. I think the US is also quite used to engaging with the Pakistani establishment, and so is China. So I do not really, see the fate of, the bilateral relations with these two key partners, sort of hanging on when the elections are going to be held. There are, of course, domestic, considerations. The establishment might be, might send out testers to see what the political temperature is like, what the volatility situation is like, what the sentiment of the people is like, and those might be more sort of determining factors for when to hold elections to get, to get desirable results. But I think external pressure would not be a deciding factor. I don't know how the IFIs are gonna, take to this. But again, the IFIs also have the countries like the US have immense sway with the IFIs as well. So, one cannot, I mean, make definitive comments on things like this. There's a lot of moving parts to them. But I think that, just because, the White House was initially quite cautious in its statements because it didn't again want to be seen as being a puppet master, right? But and they are making some interesting diplomatic moves. I mean, we had the American ambassador, when he went and visited Prime Minister Caretaker, had also gone to the election commission at the same time, right? So these, I mean, these sort of more diplomatic measures aside, when push comes to shove, I mean, for the US, for instance, I mean, it's like, engaging with Afghanistan, particularly on things like CT, which is the ball is in the military establishment's court, right? I mean, sort of, not having a meltdown with India, which is also ironic because at the same time they are building Indian capacity, and then, hoping that somehow, it won't antagonize and make Pakistan more insecure. But that's another concern. The nuclear issue is another concern, right? And they don't want dismal, absolute chaos in Pakistan either, because it's a very large country with a large population base, with sort of, also problems like rising, extremism, etc. It's got the bombs. So, those are, I think, the American concerns right now. There's not a lot of interest in Pakistan especially after the Afghan pullout. But these factors are factors that sort of anyone can deliver on, and these are the long-term engagements that the US is going to sort of, be watching for.
We get towards, yes, absolutely. And especially, I think, over the last 2 years, since 2022, and now if we kind of combine it with 2024, there's been so much flux and there's so much instability politically in Pakistan as well as socially, that if you employ a bird's eye view, this is not something very estranged. And we can only hope that the caretaker government sees its tenure through and we're able to transition into a fully elected democratic government, which brings about greater stability. And on that note, I would really like to thank you for your time. It was a very insightful discussion, and it was an absolute pleasure having you.
Same, Nauriaz.